but with about 100 to 130-year recurrence interval, and the last large earthquake being 1857, the entire San Andreas Fault is due or overdue at this point. Now, in the southernmost part of the system, this is the San Andreas Fault, San Jacinto Fault, Elsinore Fault. All of these stars represent sites that have been studied for slip rate or slip per event or paleoseismology. And we reconstructed the last 1,000 years or so of large earthquakes on the southern San Andreas system. And what's interesting about that is when you look at the system, I think if you're into pattern recognition and whatnot, you won't see much of a pattern here. These are all the magnitude 7 and larger earthquakes on the southern San Andreas system. And there doesn't seem to be any specific pattern or clustering for the main plate boundary faults. And I'm going to come back to that later. We do have these 3 earthquakes, and now we can add to it 2010. All of these are south of the border of Baja California. So the southern San Andreas system, and the entire group of faults that comprise the main plate boundary, have not ruptured since 1800 for the southernmost portions of the fault, and 1857 for the San Andreas and Central California. This is a probability plot showing that, we plotted up a number of major faults of the world and showed that, for instance, the North Anatolia Fault in Turkey, this is the recurrence interval, this is the elapsed time since the last earthquake, so of course the slope here is 1. And there's many faults that fall to the right of this curve. You have to worry about the faults that fall to the left of the curve, because those are now beyond their average recurrence interval. And we have all the orange and red, the San Andreas and San Jacinto in Southern California. Those are our faults that we're most worried about. We keep on saying we're going to have a large earthquake. Where we've been having large earthquakes are places like the Eastern California shear zone. And I'll talk very briefly about that. This is a whole group of faults that collectively take about 15% of the plate margin shear. Not a whole lot, but enough. And historically, it's been very active seismically. We've had a number of moderate and large magnitude earthquakes. The 2 largest, of course, being the 92 Landers earthquake and the 1999 Mine earthquake. And we've also gone out and trenched all of the faults in the Eastern California shear zone, the major ones at least, and tried to reconstruct the rupture history. I won't go into the details. This, of course, is the offset from the 1992 earthquake. We dig trenches across the scarps and log these trenches, date the material within the trenches, and it turns out that all of the Landers, all the faults in Eastern California shear zone have recurrence intervals on these scale of 5 to 10,000 years. They're very long-lived faults. This is the Kickapoo Fault, another trench across the last earthquake was about 6,000 years ago. This is on the Emerson Fault, worked by Rubin and C. The last earthquake on this fault was about, when they did the reconstruction, was about 7,800 years ago. The point here is that all these faults that we're seeing fail out there have very long recurrence intervals, and we're just not seeing the plate boundary faults go. This is a plot of the timing of the last earthquake for the last 10,000 years. And the interesting conclusion for these minor zones off to the east is that we're in a cluster of earthquakes. Almost every one of the faults has failed in the last 1,000 years, every one we've trenched. And we had another cluster around 5,000 and another around 9,000 years ago. So these apparently produce clusters every 5 to 10,000 years. And we're currently in a cluster, which is one of the reasons we're having so much seismic activity out there. And there's 1 or 2 faults that have not failed yet, which are likely candidates for failure in the near future if this pattern continues. On the main boundary fault, the Garlock Fault north of the Eastern California shear zone, we also find, and this is what it looks like. I think everyone can see the fault very clearly in geomorphology. There's our trench, and again we use the same criteria of finding breaks that come up, ruptures up to a surface, a paleosurface, and is filled over by unbroken stratigraphy. And we find that this fault also has had a cluster in the last couple thousand years that's coincident with the ones in the Eastern California shear zone. So what we're seeing is that the secondary faults that comprise the plate boundary in a very broad zone tend to cluster in large earthquakes with time. And the main plate boundary faults, like the San not. They seem to have more random distribution of these large earthquakes in that time period. What about the LA basin? We are aware. Okay, so we're down here in Orange County, Los Angeles up here, and we have several major faults in this area. The Elsinore, Whittier Fault, Honey Hills, the Palos Verdes faults here, the Newport Inglewood Fault comes on here, and then we have the thrust faults up in the northern margin of the basin. And again, there's been a number of paleoseismic sites that have been studied throughout the LA basin over the past couple of decades through the Southern California Earthquake Center. And I'm not going to go into details on these, but for instance, on the Whittier Fault, we've done a lot of trenching to determine the timing of past earthquakes. This. Okay, so again, same kind of story, trench the fault, get a slip rate, determine the recurrence interval, and this has been done not only on the Whittier Fault, but on almost every fault in the LA basin. This is the Sierra Madre Fault, big earthquakes, 5 to 7 meter slip events, but the return period for these, again, is long, on the order of 6 to 10,000 years. Now, Jim Dolan has just recently published a compilation of all the large earthquakes in the LA basin. And by looking at the moment released through time, he has come to an interesting conclusion. In red, it's the Eastern California shear zone that I showed earlier. In black is the LA basin faults. And you'll notice that they're out of phase. And he has suggested that for the Los Angeles basin, we're getting clusters of earthquakes that are out of phase with the Eastern California shear zone. So we've had virtually no major seismicity in the LA basin, considering it has a strain rate of about 6 to 8 millimeters a year. We had 1971 and 1994, but that's relatively little seismic moment release in the last 200 years. And his suggestion is LA basin is currently in a period of suppressed seismicity, whereas the Eastern California shear zone is lit up. So probably wouldn't spend a lot of time instrumenting Los Angeles. I would probably look more to the east. So if you're looking to instrument major faults in Southern California, the primary places I would look at are the Eastern California shear zone, where we've been having earthquakes, and then the main plate boundary faults, the San Jacinto and the San Andreas faults, because both of these faults are due for earthquakes. They're due for large earthquakes in the magnitude 7.5 to 7.9 kind of range. And at some point, we'll keep on saying this, but at some point they will rupture, and it will be probably pretty disastrous for the entire LA basin. Okay,